The Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came out, and when he saw him, he fell at Jesus' feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples, smirking, said, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Immediately, the girl got up and began to walk around. She was about 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. And he strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
You may be seated. Have you ever been in one of those situations where you can't do anything except wait? You don't have any control over how long you're going to wait. And so, if you're like me anyway, your pulse begins to increase. Smiles are impossible. It's like you can't manage it. Eventually, your resolve to be good-humored and agreeable begins to wear. Your attention becomes fractured. You start wondering if there will ever be a resolution, if what you want will ever come. Waiting is hard. Waiting is not comfortable. No one likes to wait at traffic lights that never seem to turn. No one wants to stand in line to wait to order food. If you've ever waited in an emergency department with a sick family member, you know the desperation that can set in as you wait. There's a reason nobody ever feels warm and happy inside when you're told to go sit in a waiting room. In the movie The Princess Bride, the great swordsman Inigo Montoya is waiting at the top of the cliffs of insanity. And he's waiting up there for the man in black to come. There's going to be a sword duel. And he is yelling over the edge, asking the masked man if there's any way he could speed things up. Inigo says to the masked man, assures him that, he's just waiting around to kill him, but he promises, I promise you, I will not kill you until you reach the top. And the masked man says that while that's very comforting, Inigo would just have to wait. I hate wait, is Inigo's reply. I hate wait. This memorable phrase nicely captures what many of us feel, not just about petty things like traffic lights, but big things too. How long will my loved one suffer? Why do we have to wait for real change in this world? I know many right now are feeling anxiety about the future of our country as we wait to see what happens at the election this fall. Or perhaps we're waiting for the restoration of relationships. I feel like I've had too many conversations lately with parents who are estranged from their children, often for reasons well beyond their control. This estrangement is painful, but it's all the more painful because there's nothing we can do to change it. Sometimes we just have to wait. Our gospel text for this morning gives two interrelated stories about people who are forced to wait. One has been waiting for healing for a very long time, while another is forced to wait in the midst of one of the most important moments of his life. Our gospel writer, Mark, sets up the scene for the first story. A massive crowd is gathered, and Jairus, a well-respected and wealthy leader of the synagogue, bursts in, maybe with a sense of privilege, frantic, begging Jesus to come. His 12-year-old daughter is sick, indeed, at death's door. Her life is in the balance, Jesus. We have no time. Delaying is not an option. I cannot wait. If we don't go, she dies. And so Jesus goes. He feels the man's urgency and goes to heal the girl. But en route, we run into another character, a woman who has been waiting for a very long time. The woman is not 12 years old, like the girl, but she has been suffering from chronic bleeding for 12 long years. Mark tells us that this woman has spent all her money on doctors, but that her suffering had only gotten worse. Any of us who have ever gone to a medical provider and left without an actionable diagnosis can perhaps relate. It's disheartening. It's deflating. We want there to be something that we can do. It's hard to wait for a resolution to a difficult health problem. So you can just imagine that when this bleeding woman hears about Jesus, this famed healer, she knows she must go to him. In an act of faith and of desperation, she decides that she will touch Jesus' cloak. If only I can touch the hem of his garment, I can be healed. And the story could have ended there. Jesus could have kept traveling to heal the sick girl, perhaps giving the woman a passing glimpse of pity. But instead, Jesus stops everything, the frantic race to Jairus' house seemingly forgotten. Jesus wants to know who touched him. And the disciples, who do not like to wait, are none too happy about this delay. Neither is Jairus. Can you imagine? You have the most powerful healer ever to walk the earth in your clutches, right? You're walking to your daughter. And when things couldn't be more urgent, he stops, heals some random person, and then goes on to have a full conversation, figure out who it was. You can imagine how Jairus' anxiety would have spiked. And then his worst fear comes true. Some people from his household come and tell him, "You don't have to bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter has died." Jairus had tried so hard, tried to hold on to hope while waiting for Jesus to heal this other woman, and yet death was what he got in return. Or so it seemed. Jesus, against all hope or reason, says to Jairus, "Your daughter is not dead. She's just sleeping." And having completed his business with the woman who had been bleeding, Jesus heads on to heal the girl. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Believing, or trusting, same word in Greek, plays an important role in our experience of waiting. I think that we, along with Inigo Montoya, hate wait because we hate to feel powerless. We hate to feel out of control. And yet the truth is that we are ultimately in control of very little in this life. We can't control if cancer comes or not. We can't control the actions of others. We can't control the weather. We can't control the outcome of elections. So what are we, as people of faith, to do? We know that faith is part of the answer. Our scriptures are full of examples of people who trust God, who put their faith in God. But what does it mean to be faithful in the face of things we cannot change? Jairus and the woman who was bleeding model something very important for us, I think. They heard about Jesus, and what did they do? They took action. They simply showed up with their needs and requests. They went to Jesus. Jesus commends the faith of the woman that led her to him. "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Jesus isn't saying that somehow her faith had miraculously affected the cure. Jesus means that her faith is what compelled her to come to him. Her faith made her take action. Similarly, it's faith that leads Jairus to seek out Jesus and heal his daughter. What we see in these stories is that trusting God and waiting for God are not incompatible with action. Waiting often feels passive, but it doesn't have to be a passive exercise at all. Faith motivates us to do what we can, even as we wait for help with the things we cannot change. For instance, when we wait for the restoration of estranged relationships, we don't just sit around. We can get to work on ourselves. We can seek to grow. We can examine maybe how we've behaved in relationships. We can be ready to provide loving, non-anxious presence when the time for restoration is right. This doesn't change the amount of time we have to wait, but it might change us as we wait. Especially when it comes to things that we're asking for from God, I'd go so far to say that waiting without action is missing the point. We do not simply ask God for things and then hope it all turns out okay. We petition God to act in the world, and then we get to work. The bleeding woman took bold action to touch Jesus' robe. Jairus sought out Jesus for his daughter. There's a reason that we don't simply gather on Sundays to pray. We follow our service this morning with acts of service in the community and the wider world. We ask God for help and wait for God, but we do so actively. Faith involves waiting for God to show up and keeping our eyes open for God's action, even when God doesn't fix everything. We know that God doesn't fix everything. Even in our biblical stories, Jesus doesn't wave a magic wand and make everything perfect for everyone. We don't hear about the aftermath of this woman's healing. The text never says that Jesus restored all her money that she'd spent on all those doctors. We don't read about what happened to Jairus and his family afterward, but we know that Jesus' healing action didn't take away all their problems forever. But as long as the woman and Jairus and his family drew breath, you know what they did do? They carried a recollection of God's faithfulness with them that would help them persevere when times got tough. They learned that God shows up, even when it happens on a different timeline than we'd like. People of faith are people for whom God has shown up. And if you reflect, in one way or another, at some point in your life, you've seen God come through. You've seen tangible manifestations of grace. Waiting for God, even if you hate wait, means remembering those moments of grace to help carry us through when the waiting gets hard. I want to conclude by teaching you a prayer attributed to the medieval mystic Julian of Norwich that our kids learned this week at VBS. The prayer encourages us to wait actively, to trust God through the waiting, and to receive as a gift whatever may come through the process. It has 4 movements: await, allow, accept, and attend. And I will start the prayer, and I'd encourage you to echo with we await, then we allow, we accept, we attend. Please join me. Oh, it has hand movements too. I forgot to mention that. So, because it's VBS. We await God's presence to come and restore us. We await to come and restore us. We'll just do the whole thing. That'll be great. We allow God's presence to come to us or not, being at peace with our experience. Allow God's presence to come to us or not, being at peace with our experience. We accept a sense of God's presence or even its absence. We accept a sense of God's presence or even its absence. And we attend to God's call to us as God's people. We attend to God's call to us as God's people, trusting that God is revealed in the waiting, as hard as it may be. That God's revealed in the waiting, as hard as it may be. Amen.